right, so tonight we're going to talk about God choosing David. And a lot of you just shared times in your life when God has chosen you for something that you didn't expect, something that came out of nowhere. And in my life, I can think of a couple examples. One kind of silly, back to my childhood, and one that's really kind of currently going on right now. I remember when I was in high school, I loved sports, but I was not always, necessarily the best athlete. I was average. But usually average in high school doesn't mean a whole lot, all right? And so I played pretty much any sport growing up, but then in high school, my best sport ended up being tennis. And so you can laugh at me all you want, that's fine, I understand. But I was a tennis player in high school, and again, even on my tennis team, there were 7 varsity spots, I was about number 4 on my tennis team, and I was a senior, so I just by default was pretty much the only senior who had kind of been part of the varsity team for 4 years. So I got to be the captain, and that was cool. But at the end of the year, we have an awards banquet for all fall sports, and you're sitting there and you're hearing about all these different awards that these different athletes are getting. Really good athletes, that are in your school and things like that, and. Then they get to this award that they simply just call the Sportsmanship Award. Now, this is an award that they give to just one person on any sport, and it's really just what it says. It's a Sportsmanship Award. It's somebody who, demonstrates good character and is a good sport and winning or losing, loses gracefully, all those kind of things. And so I remember sitting there and kind of, you have all these great athletes getting all these awards, and then we get to the Sportsmanship Award, and and all of a sudden, as they begin to talk, they mention my name for this award, and it kind of catches me off guard. But as I look back and I think about it, it's one of those things that I look back in high school and I'm pretty proud of, because that goes to show, as a high school student, I was trying to live out my faith. I was trying to be a good testimony. And it was kind of neat because I see that people recognized, at least those good qualities in me. And so I never expected to be chosen for that award, but it was an award that I was given, an award that, I got this plaque and all those kind of things. And it wasn't something that just my coach chose. It was something that was chosen by many other people, even outside of that realm. And so, again, that's what we're talking about tonight when we talk about David being chosen as king. And another example that I'm really currently living is this idea of planning a church. Many of you know my story. I never, ever, in my wildest dreams, would have envisioned planning a church. I simply wanted to be a youth pastor. That's what I would love doing. That's what I looked forward to doing. Went to college to do just that. And then all of a sudden, a few years ago, God began to stir in my heart and began to put on my heart to move back to the Northeast, back to New Milford, and plant a church. And there was a lot of kind of arguing with God. God, I'm not, I can't do that. God, I'm not equipped for that. God, think about all these other people that would be way more qualified for this job. But yet, for whatever reason, I recognized and eventually just submitted to this idea that, okay, God, you've chosen me for this. And I'm just going to simply learn to walk by faith, trust in you. And it was mentioned earlier, recognize that God doesn't necessarily call the equipped. But what he does is he equips those he calls. And that's what we're going to see as we look at the life of David tonight. And so we read 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1 through 13. A very familiar story, a story that many of us know. Really, verse 7 is one of those often quoted verses if you're around church for any length of time. But I just want to kind of walk through this and point out a couple things as we go, as we think about David being anointed here as king. And so it says in verse number 1, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And now, before we get to verse number 2, that verse really kind of caught me off guard as I was studying, because it talks there about Samuel grieving. Now, we already talked last week about the kind of decisions that Saul had made. Here Saul has walked in disobedience. He's disobeyed God. And now you have Samuel, a prophet, the Bible says, who is grieving over God rejecting Saul as king. As I thought about that, I began to think about how often in our lives we sometimes get comfortable with people not doing the right thing. Right? That's really where Samuel was. Saul wasn't living a life that was pursuing after God. Saul wasn't living a life where he was walking in obedience. But yet Samuel and many of the other people had kind of become complacent and just allowed that kind of spirit to just kind of resonate within their nation. And so you have the prophet of God, a man who is supposed to be pushing the people to really pursue God, grieving at the fact that God is now removing this king who is not following after God. And so that kind of caught me off guard, because I thought, in our culture, how often do we sometimes allow wickedness and evil just to kind of go unchecked and almost get comfortable with those things around us when we know those things ought not to be going on, and we do nothing about it. We just kind of wash our hands of it, brush it on the rug, and kind of just say, oh, I'm going to live my life, and not really worry about those things. And so we see God finally saying, Samuel, stop grieving over Saul. The decision is made. It's time for you to move on and continue walking in what I have for you. And so it goes on to say in verse number 2, and Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you. And so here we have this command of God saying, Samuel, I want you to go. I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and I want you to anoint the next king, a king that I have chosen. And what I want you to recognize and see here is, what is Samuel's first response? It's not one of absolute obedience. It's not one of absolute faith. What's the first thing we see here from Samuel? We see an attitude, exactly, of fear. And as I thought about my life, I thought about how often that is my first response when I feel God prompting my heart to take the next step. Right? I mean, think about it. In your life, think about the times that you felt that nudge of God, and you knew that God was directing you to take whatever the step was, and how you responded in that moment. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has responded many times with fear. And with, well, God, what if? Or God, there's no way. Or God, but how is this going to happen? And that's what we see from Samuel, this prophet of God. God is trying to move him along, get the nation to the next step, but all of a sudden we have Samuel who is paralyzed by fear and says, well, what if Saul hears about it? He's going to kill me. But then you see God's response. God says, Samuel, don't worry about that. I'm calling you to do this. I'm going to take care of the situation. And again, if God's calling us to take the step, we can bank on the fact that we can step in faith, because God's got our back. If he's calling you to do it, he's going to equip you to do it. He's going to provide all that's needed for you to do it. You and me, we just need to learn to respond with faith. But the antithesis of faith is fear. And so often we struggle to respond by faith, and we allow fear to paralyze us and crippleize us and keep us from doing what it is that God intends for us to do. And so we go on, and it says that finally Samuel obeyed. Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, do you come peaceably? And he said, peaceably I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And so what I want us to also see here is that it talks about Samuel begins to go. What I want us to notice about this passage is that when God called Samuel, God didn't give Samuel the whole picture of what was going to happen, right? God never said, okay, Samuel, I want you to go to Jesse's house, and you're going to usher all these sons in, and eventually you're going to get to the last son, and that's the one that's going to be king. You anoint him, and his name is David. That's not what he said. He simply said, go to the house of Jesse, and then I'll show you from there. Reminds me of Abraham. God said, Abraham, I want you to leave your homeland. But he never told Abraham where it was he was going. He said, just go that direction, and I'll lead you, and I'll guide you as you go. You see, so often, the reason we get crippled by fear is because we want to see the big picture. We want to walk by sight instead of walking by faith. But see, what God is always trying to do in our lives, and what God's always trying to do in our hearts, is to stretch our faith and to get us to places where we have to learn to rely on him. And that's why he says, Samuel, just take the next step. And I know in my life so many times, it's not God showing me this big picture of what's going to happen as a result of my obedience. He just simply says, take the next step. Take the next step. And as you take the next step, then what's God do? He then reveals the next step. And when you take that step, he then reveals the next step. And so we see that here from this prophet of God. God doesn't say, hey, you're going to go anoint David. He says, go to the house of Jesse. And so he goes to the house of Jesse. And then he goes through this process. And God is all along the way directing him and guiding him. So let's see what it says. And so when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen thee. So again, we see he's calling all these sons before him, and as each one appears, Samuel looks at him and gets confirmation from God, no, this isn't the one. Then we get to verse 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And so here we have this story of David being anointed as king. And there's a couple things I want us to kind of take away from this story. The first one is what we've already talked about, this idea of what it means to walk by faith. Walking by faith is not asking God to reveal the entire picture to you. It's learning to walk in the light that God has already revealed. Take it one step at a time. But then the other thing I think we see here is the fact that God has chosen David. A man that we're going to come to find out later is a man after his own heart, a man who has a passion and a heart for the things of God, a man who is sensitive to, the things of God and just really wants to please God, a man really different than Saul. But in this passage, in this story, we see that that is not something that David ever expected to happen. What was David doing at the time that this whole procession was going on? He was a shepherd, right? He was taking care of some sheep out in a field. Nobody expected him to be the one that Samuel came to see. All the other brothers were there. The first one came, and Samuel looks at him and sizes him up and probably says, well, he's tall and he's strong and he looks smart and all these kind of things. And he begins to look at it from a human point of view and says, well, this must be the king. He's the firstborn, so he's probably a good leader. But God says no. You see, so often we try, maybe it's ourselves that we think is unqualified, or we look at other people and think, well, there's no way that God could use me, or there's no way that God could use them. But yet we see in the story of David that even though nobody else saw David's heart and saw what David would become, the Bible makes it clear that God saw his heart and God knew what David could become. Mm-hmm. And really the whole point of this story and the whole point of this passage is this idea that God saw David's heart. He knew the kind of man that David was. And you can sit here and have this appearance that fools everybody around you, and you can look like you know what's going on, and you can be the smartest person in your family, and you can be the best looking, and your graduating class, and you can be all these things. But at the end of the day, the thing that matters more than anything else is the state of your heart. Because that's what the Bible says God looks at. That's what God sees. It says man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And when God looked at David, he saw a heart that was passionate for him. He saw a heart that was pure. All throughout the Psalms, you see David talking about just how important it is to be consecrated before the Lord, to be pure before the Lord. In fact, Psalm 24, verse 1 through 3. In fact, let me read it. I'll turn there. We just see this idea about David and just how much he understood the importance of being pure before the Lord. He says in verse 3, "Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart." He says that's the person that can really enter the presence of God. In this passage, you see Samuel consecrate the people before they have this big feast. That's this idea of purifying our hearts and purifying ourselves. In those days, it probably meant they took a bath, they changed their clothes. But the picture here is God is looking for a heart that's pure. Not perfect, because none of us can be that. But a heart that's pure and a heart that's passionate for the things of God. And that's what we see in the life of David. He was a man who was desperate for the presence of God. He was a man who was passionate for the things of God. And he was a man who was pure in his heart. He wasn't perfect. We see him make mistakes. Later on, you see him mess up and sin. But yet then you see his confession in Psalm 51. He says, "God, create in me a clean heart. Purify my heart. I desperately want to be pure before you." And so God is looking for men today, just like he was looking for a man back then to lead Israel. And he's not looking at all the things that you and I often look at. What he's looking at is the heart. What he's looking at is what's in here. Your integrity, your character, the passion that you have for him. Those are the kind of men that God is going to promote, that God is going to use in powerful ways. And I want you to notice that when we look at David's life and we look at him being chosen, one of the huge aspects of this story is that he was simply being faithful where God had him, right? So often we want God to do greater things with our life, but we're not willing to even be faithful where God has us today. You tracking with me? You understand what I'm saying? Like, I want God to do these great things with me. I want God to use me in my workplace. I want to see all my coworkers come to Christ. But yet, when you're living at home with your wife and your kids, or whatever the situation may be, you're not being the kind of example that God's calling you to be. And so you can't even be faithful in that and expect God to use you over here in this situation. Or it could be any other example. But David was being faithful in what God placed him in as a shepherd, taking care of some sheep. And because of his faithfulness, God saw that in his heart and was able to move him to something bigger, something greater, and said, all right, I see this heart, and I'm going to promote him to be the next king of Israel. He's a man after my own heart. And that's what I want my life to be. That's what my prayer is. I hope that's your prayer. God, help me to be a man after your own heart. Never says that David was perfect. Never says that David was sinless. But God chose and anointed David because of his heart. And God's chosen you, and he's anointed you to do something in your life, in your family, in your workplace. But in order for you to accomplish that, it's going to have to be because you are a man who has a heart like David, who's passionate about God, who's striving for purity, and who's simply learning to just be faithful and learn to walk by faith. That make sense? All right, so we can stop the video.